It is my privilege now to extend a warm and cordial welcome to our distinguished speaker, Dr. Palanivel Thiaga Rajan, Honorable Minister for Information Technology and Digital Services, to deliver the inaugural address. Dr. Rajan represents the fourth generation of his family's engagement in the Dravidian movement, and he is a third generation elected representative. In his capacity as the Minister for Information Technology and Digital Services, he has undertaken the build-out of the party's technology platforms and a cadre over 150,000 office bearers across the state. He is also a designated spokesperson for the party, focusing on economic, budget, and state central finances and policy matters. He has an MBA from MIT Sloan School of Management, a PhD from the University of Buffalo, and has a stellar corporate career in the financial services industry before joining politics full-time. We are truly honored to have him grace this occasion with his presence. He will be speaking on government communications, the good, the bad, and the beyond. Please put your hands together and welcome the man of the hour. Over to you, Mr. Thiaga Rajan.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for inviting me to this event. I must first thank Mr. Madhavan. I can't see him, he must be somewhere in the audience, because he reached out to me, and at first I was a bit reluctant because I was at an event a couple of days ago and somebody introduced me as saying he built his reputation on speaking truth to power when I was in opposition. Now, the reality is it's a lot easier to speak truth when you're out of office. And you have to be very careful when you speak truth in office. But anyway, I agreed because of my friendship with Madhavan. And I thank Amit Prabhu, who worked through a couple of hiccups to get me to be here. I'm also delighted to meet Justin Green, who's going to speak after me. Good Irishman, I can tell from his accent. And I think it's very, very appropriate that this event is being held in Chennai for the first time in Asia, for the first time in India. I think it reflects the growing importance of Asia in the global political, geopolitical debate or axis, as well as of India. There's no other country of this scale with these demographics, especially in a kind of post the 3-decade boom of China. All attention is on India. Within India, I think, we've always prided ourselves on being a very liberal, very inclusive, very socially just state. But at some level, it goes deeper than that. Going back probably 3,000 years ago to the 400 ancient Tamil poems known as the Purananuru. One of the famous lines is Yadum Ure Yavarum Kelir, which says, to us all towns are one, all men are our kin. So this international outlook that we've had through thousands of years is, I think, appropriate for us to be the host of this first event in India, in Asia, for the Global Alliance. It's also important because in the field you're all in this public relations, communications, enterprise, all of this is built on language. And as far as language goes, if it's not the oldest, it is one of the oldest languages continuously in use and the core of our identity as individuals. And so we're very suited to host a conference that is built on communication through language. I'll start with language. At some level, all of the research back from my days in cognitive psychology, language and the ability to craft language is probably as good an indication of cognitive ability as anything else. Communications, which is one of the most important uses of language, is the core of forming all relationships. Of course, relationships can be relatively benign, like public relations, which can have very positive impact. It could be relatively mercenary, like advertising or marketing, which is intended for particular self-interested goal. Or it could veer into the outright propaganda, where perception trumps reality. And in some ways, what we've learned through history is that propaganda is to fascism and authoritarianism what the bludgeon is to totalitarian states. So there's a wide spectrum when it comes to communications and public relations. But before I get into government, let me start first with politicians and political parties, because that's where all of us, at least in democratically elected governments, come from. I would say that most politicians have this innate belief, if only I could convey my true intent, my true capacity, my true ambition to the people, surely they will vote for me. That's really where it starts. As a candidate myself for a couple of elections and then managing the campaign for others through the party and my roles in the party, I can tell you we stress about this no extent, right? There's no limit. We keep on more technology, more granularity, more feedback loops, and all of politics at some level is about this kind of communication. And in fact, I would say one of my learnings in the last 7-8 years that I've been in public life is that very, very often the messenger is more important than the message. After a while, people start making opinions based on the messenger rather than the content of the message. Now, technology gives us all kinds of edges, but if you go back to the pre-internet era, in fact, the pre-movie era, when really the Dravidian movement, the social justice movement, the self-respect movement that I'm part of started, we had to find ways of communicating very effectively with people. And if you look at the history of our party, our movement, a lot of actors were involved, because actors already captured the imagination of the public, already had this connectivity through a fan base, and much more than actors benefited from politics, political parties benefited from actors. Very often we created vehicles for the transmission of our message, because movies and actors over time were really the mass gatherers, the attractors of masses. It is also unique a bit, I think, to our politics that we have a very particular style of rhetorical public speaking. Much of our movement was built through public speaking. When there was no internet, when there was no television, when there was almost limited radio controlled by the state, the birth and growth of our movement happened through what we used to call street corner meetings and public meetings. And back in the day, public meetings led by intellectuals like the founder of our party were so much in demand that people used to pay and buy tickets to come and listen. Most of you know today the world has gone upside down. Most political parties need to gather crowds through some other means. But back in the day, when it was still intellectual, when it was still value driven, effectively the ability to get people to a place and then have this rhetorical style that could get them engaged in the debate was the basis of much of our success. I was fascinated to learn a few years ago that this rhetorical style, this Dravidian political rhetorical style, actually has a lot in common with the Baptist and other Christian preachers in the Deep South. Many of them had transferred or been assigned to Sri Lanka in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and they developed this style. And the Tamil language, which is common to some parts of Sri Lanka and us, those people started using this style. And we found it very good way of engaging with the people, the ability to have rhetoric as a way of getting people's intellectual engagement. And over time, I think we have discovered this old adage in the public relations business that in many instances, the medium is the message. So the means of communication, the means of transfer, the medium is really the message. Now, I want to say something about governments very neutrally and then the state of communications in a more pointed way. At some level, governments have multiple responsibilities when it comes to communicating with the people, right? At the very least, at the core of it, at least we should be able to communicate to the people when there are emergencies, some weather situation has developed, some, indication that there is a natural disaster about to happen. And we should have a means of reaching the most people in the quickest time in a way that they can understand and react, and hopefully we have plans in place. At the next level, most governments in welfare states and socialist countries have a lot of schemes that benefit those who are eligible to get those benefits. Mostly they're not universal because we can't afford universal, but we target schemes and we deliver different levels. Now you take a place like Tamil Nadu, we do more relatively universal things than most states. For example, it's the only state I know where everybody gets access to the public distribution system, the ration shops as we call them. And there are 7 or 8 or 9 levels of beneficiaries from the poorest to the least in need. And they have different levels of benefits. Now, there's a kind of communication component both on the way out and the way back. On the way out, we need to let people know what is it that they're entitled to, usually because our research suggests those most in need of the support, most in need of the government scheme, tend to be those who are least likely to be able to access it. Now, this is really profound. If we look at things like the old age widow's pension or the old age lady's pension that we give as a state, we find that we reach almost everybody, but those that don't have access to technology, because you can't apply online if you don't have access to technology, and those who are not living with somebody else who can teach them how to do it, those people fall through the cracks. And those are actually the ones that are most in need. We also need, as in some states, a reverse flow of information, a feedback loop. Rajasthan, for example, has done something tremendous with the Jan Suchna portal, where they publish all the beneficiaries of every scheme by ward, by district, by village, and the public get to know what is really happening, because otherwise beneficiaries are less likely to go and proclaim from the rooftops that they're beneficiaries, and those who have been left out or claim to have been left out will go and shout that from the rooftops. So there's at least these two. But at some other level, most governments, surely being run by politicians, have interest in building goodwill, in having good relationships, and having the quality of their work be projected onto the image or the minds of the public, because sooner or later we all have to face elections again. And I think now we'll start veering a bit into the dangerous state. I'll tell you first, maybe I'll tell you the good news first. The good news, I think, is that if we do the right kind of branding, we can really leverage the kind of impact that our good work does. I'll give you 1 or 2 examples. The first example is that after we came to power, we modified a scheme. We had a scheme where we used to encourage girls to stay in college. I was particularly impressed with the theme of the dance, because this is the state where we are focused on the equality of women for over 100 years, from the beginning of the Dravidian movement. The first place in India where women had the right to vote, the first elected female legislator, the first elected officer, that is the deputy speaker of the Legislative Council. All that happened in the old Madras presidency, which we were part of. But over the years, many schemes for benefiting women at various stages in their life had come through. And one that was intended to encourage them to stay in college and I mean, to stay in education long enough to go to higher education, actually was a kind of second order benefit scheme. The state said that if you stay and become a graduate of high school, you will be entitled to a grant of X. It was, I think, over time it grew to about 25,000 rupees and 4 grams of gold for a wedding benefit, so that it would reduce the burden on the parents. And if you stayed in college and got out of college, then that amount became 50,000 and 8 grams. Now you must remember, this is a place where, for the sake of empowering women, for the sake of reducing their dependence on others, and for the sake of making families think of them as somehow greater support needing than boys, that is girls and boys, we have done a lot of things, not just the right to vote, but compulsory education, when it was first legislated in 1921, covered both boys and girls. The right to property, equal inheritance, was first legislated here. And even the notion of a self-respect marriage, so that you didn't have to pay somebody else to officiate at your wedding. The act was passed in 1969. In Tamil Nadu, you can get married without having to pay somebody else to do the ceremony for it. After all of this, we still had this benefit scheme that was in some way a secondary benefit for education. So our chief minister, when we came to office, asked us to redesign the scheme for various reasons, because the previous government had actually not fulfilled the scheme for 4 years, and there was a big backlog, and we started having complexity. How many of these weddings are still valid? If we really didn't give the money when they were getting married, they've already gone into debt. That would have compounded interest. There's a lot of complications. So what we did was we changed the scheme, and we said, if you are a government school student, meaning that you're usually not well off enough to pay private school fees, our data suggests that more than half of them do not continue into college, despite the average across the state being that 52% of all college-age children enroll in college, highest in the country, double the national average, yet the poor, and particularly the poor girls, were not being included into this enrollment. So we changed the scheme, and we said, if you stay up till 10th in government school, and then you go to do a diploma or a polytechnic degree, the state will pay you a scholarship of 1,000 rupees a month as long as you continue to stay enrolled. And if you stay till 12th, then we will give you 1,000 rupees if you go to college, and as long as you stay enrolled in how many graduate courses you take, we will keep paying this scholarship. That was a wonderful change. The question now is, how do we brand this scheme? It was called something else after a particular lady. We continue to use the name, but what we now change this to, instead of saying Tali Ki Tangam, which is what the scheme was called, gold for your tali or for your ornament for the marriage, we changed it to Pudumai Pen scheme, that is the new age woman. That, I think, signals the kind of intent that we have, and it really helped us penetrate the consciousness of the people as to what our philosophy was, why we made the change, and what our history had been that got us till here, and what we saw the future as going. So sometimes governments get things right, and we spend time in doing the kinds of things that all of you do on a daily basis, which is the branding, the connectivity, the communication, the sophistication that increases penetration, increases reach. But in fact, most of the time, governments are very archaic. All of you would have interacted with some version of the Department of Information and Public Relations. Mostly it uses, traditional things like newspaper front page advertisements, sometimes TV advertisements. Now, inherently, governments have two levers over the media, at least as best I can tell. One is the carrot. Many governments spend a lot of money, irrespective of the effectiveness. They spend a lot of money on advertising, or on communications, or on, public relations. And so they can direct the flow to people who are more conducive. The other, of course, is the deterrent, because governments also run kind of the moderation of what is acceptable speech and what is not. And I would say, without treading across the line of politics, I would say that broadly in our country, we are starting to see that the independence of the media is starting to be curtailed. And we're starting to see a lot of media become extensions or become an arm of the state and effectively lose their function in a democracy. I will say with no little alarm, but also a bit of envy, that by far the best propaganda machine that I have seen in my lifetime is the propaganda machine we have now in India, where we conflate a party that has about 37% of the vote in the last election. We conflate that party's leader with the government, with the identity of the nation, with the identity of 1.4 billion people. And at some level, as I say, with a little bit of envy that people can be that successful at it, I say it with no little alarm as a citizen in a democracy. I could say a lot more about the negative aspects, but I don't want to be a kind of naysayer. The profession has tremendous value. Most of us, as I say, still believe that if only we could be truly understood, if only our vision could be truly disseminated, then we would actually find it very easy in the polls and in the administration of office. But this is not new. In this very town in 1917, when the precursor party to our party was formed, one of his objectives of the three, only three, one of the objectives was to disseminate by public lectures, by distribution of literature, and by other means, thereby to create public opinion. If I fast forward another 30 or 40 years to somebody like Noam Chomsky, in his book, The Political Economy of Mass Media, he states it slightly differently. He says, the kind of participation which is possible in any democracy is greatly determined by the kind and variety of information about political events that the average person has access to. And in fact, the problem with sound bites is that anybody can say anything in 2 minutes, but it takes a lot of time to explain why that's not true. So we live in a dangerous age. I used to be the head of my party's information technology wing, which I resigned when I took up my previous post as finance minister and personnel minister of the state. And I can tell you that between 2016, when I entered public life, and 2021, when I last ran a campaign for an election, the ability to target messaging at effectively zero marginal cost, by location, by gender, by age, by sequence of the message, even in a country like India, where we don't have nearly the profile of every individual that most Western economies and developed economies have, has grown exponentially. That ability to do the kind of targeted messaging has grown exponentially. And even as I understand the many benefits and the theme, creating goodwill, I am quite nervous about the power of this kind of propaganda generating technology and the kinds of platforms that are available. And I hope that professionals like yourselves, when you apply these technologies, will retain in your conscience some notion of the greater good, or at least not descending into a less ideal state than we already are. With that request, ladies and gentlemen, let me thank you again for this invitation. On behalf of the Chief Minister, myself, the people of Tamil Nadu, I am thrilled that you're here in Chennai. I know you have a multi-day event ahead. I hope you will have a wonderful time, a lot of learning, a lot of fellowship. First gathering after 3 years. I'm sure that many of you are meeting after many years apart. I know it will be a good few days of camaraderie. You have chosen a great place. Please have fun and a great conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for the truth bombs, the articulation, the humor, and thank you for the lines. We do indeed live in a dangerous age. Inclusion, language, communication, relationships, and the perceptional realities that we traverse with politics, social justice movements, of rhetoric and intelligent and intellectual engagement, and the line which said, medium is the message. Thank you, sir. We really appreciate what you've chosen to share with us, your expertise, your perspectives. We are indeed grateful to you for being a part of this and being a part of this historic moment in your home state together with all of us.